In the small town of Mount Vernon, Illinois, Jana Reynolds lived a life that many would describe as simple yet filled with promise. At 22 years old, she was a nursing student at the local community college, driven by a deep passion for helping others. Her life was just beginning, with dreams of becoming a nurse and making a meaningful difference in the world. Jana's family, particularly her parents, were incredibly proud of her ambitions. She was an only child, and her close-knit family formed the cornerstone of her life. Jana was married to Jeff Reynolds, a man who worked long hours, often leaving Jana to manage the house and her studies. Despite the challenges of juggling school and a growing marriage, Jana was full of life. She often spoke about her aspirations and her love for working with people, her eyes lighting up whenever she mentioned her future career. On the evening of May 5, 1988, Jana was at home alone as her husband had left for work. This would be the last time anyone would see her alive. The next morning when Jeff returned, he found their home in a state of unsettling silence. Jana's car was still parked in the driveway, and the back door was broken open. Inside, he discovered his wife's lifeless body in their bedroom, brutally murdered. The scene was nothing short of horrific. There were signs of a violent struggle and evidence of sexual assault. Yet, the killer had left no clear trail. Joe Tucker, a name that would later be etched into the dark history of Jana's murder, was not a stranger to the Reynolds family, but he was also not a close acquaintance. At the time of the murder, Tucker was in his early 30s. He had worked at a local restaurant where Jana had been employed as well. Their paths had crossed there, but their interactions had been limited and professional. There was nothing that stood out about Joe Tucker, no warning signs that he would one day become the man responsible for such a heinous crime. Joe was known to be a troubled soul, someone who struggled to keep his life together. He had been in and out of various jobs, never quite finding stability. His personal relationships were often strained, and he was known for his short temper. Friends and acquaintances described him as having a dark side, but nothing that would have immediately suggested he was capable of murder. Tucker's connection to Jana was nothing more than that of coworkers who had a passing acquaintance. Their relationship was cordial, but it was not one that would have been considered close. There was no hint of a romantic or deep personal connection between them. However, as events would later reveal, Tucker had been in the area on the night of May 5, 1988. And his path, though seemingly distant from Jana's, would ultimately collide with hers in the most tragic of ways. On the night of May 5, 1988, as Jana sat alone in her home, Joe Tucker's presence was felt in the shadows, though no one knew it at the time. As her husband left for work, Jana likely settled into a quiet evening, perhaps studying or preparing for the following day. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery, but it is clear that something set Tucker off. Perhaps it was a fleeting moment of opportunity, perhaps a deep-seated frustration that had been building for years. Whatever the reason, it was in this moment that Joe Tucker's life would take a dark and irreversible turn. For reasons that remain unclear, Tucker made his way to Jana's house. He broke into the home, confronting Jana in her own sanctuary. What happened in the bedroom was brutal. A violent struggle ensued, and Jana fought desperately to protect herself. But Tucker was too strong, and in a moment of rage, he ended her life. When Jeff Reynolds returned home the next morning, he found the house in disarray. The back door had been broken open, and inside, his worst nightmare awaited. His wife, the woman he loved, was gone, her life taken in a senseless act of violence. The initial investigation led nowhere. There were no obvious suspects, and the crime appeared to be one of random violence. The case grew cold, and years passed without any real leads. For over a decade, the murder of Jana Reynolds remained unsolved. The small town of Mount Vernon struggled with the mystery, and Jana's family was left in a state of limbo, wondering if they would ever find out what happened to their beloved daughter. Jeff Reynolds, in particular, was devastated by the loss. The pain of losing his wife, coupled with the uncertainty of not knowing who was responsible, weighed heavily on him. The case, however, was never truly forgotten. In 2001, after years of no progress, investigators decided to re-examine the evidence using new forensic technology. DNA analysis had advanced considerably since the time of the original investigation, and it offered the potential for breakthroughs in cases that had gone cold. As the evidence was revisited, it became clear that new, previously unnoticed DNA evidence had been left behind by the killer. This crucial discovery would soon lead investigators to Joe Tucker, the man who had worked with Jana years earlier. While the DNA evidence was crucial, there was more to the investigation than just this breakthrough. Tucker had been in the vicinity of the crime scene on the night of the murder, and investigators now had a strong case linking him to the crime. Once the DNA evidence had definitively linked Joe Tucker to the crime scene, police brought him in for questioning. Tucker, who had been working at a local restaurant where Jana had also been employed, was not initially a primary suspect in the case. He had not come under serious suspicion during the early stages of the investigation. However, with the DNA evidence placing him at the scene, investigators began to focus more closely on him. Tucker's interrogation was intense. Police laid out the facts of the case. They had his DNA at the crime scene, his proximity to the area around the time of the murder, and the forensic evidence that connected him directly to Jana Reynolds' death. Investigators made it clear to Tucker that they had overwhelming evidence and that there was nowhere for him to hide. At first, Tucker denied his involvement. He maintained that he had no part in the murder and seemed to struggle with the reality of being implicated in such a heinous crime. Despite the mounting evidence against him, he refused to confess immediately. Joe Tucker's confession did not come easily. It followed a prolonged period of intense questioning, and much of the success in eliciting his admission was due to the carefully orchestrated psychological approach used by investigators. Detectives recognized that Tucker was a man with many layers, someone who could be worn down not with brute force but with a more methodical, patient strategy that targeted his conscience. The questioning began with the detectives gently probing Tucker's background and his life, giving him the space to talk about his past and his experiences. They made sure to present themselves not as enemies, but as professionals seeking the truth. The detectives, aware of the psychological nuances of interrogation, made a deliberate effort to highlight the importance of Tucker's honesty. "You've been through a lot," one of the detectives might have said. "We understand people make mistakes. The most important thing now is for you to come forward and be honest with us. This is your chance to make it right, to clear your conscience." At first, Tucker seemed resistant, repeating the same denials. "I didn't do it. I wasn't there. I don't know anything about it," he said, his voice increasingly shaky but firm in his refusals. However, as the interrogation wore on, and the mounting DNA evidence became impossible to ignore, the pressure began to build. Investigators didn't push too hard initially, but instead, they allowed the evidence to do the talking. One of the detectives, in a calm but purposeful tone, spoke to Tucker about the overwhelming nature of the evidence. "Joe, we have your DNA at the crime scene. We know you were there. It's time to be honest now, to stop running from the truth. You owe it to yourself and to her family." These words were crucial. By emphasizing that the case was no longer about what Tucker could deny, but rather about facing the reality of the situation, the detectives helped him shift from denial to a point where his guilt could no longer be denied. After hours of questioning, the detectives left Tucker alone for a short period. When they returned, they continued with their steady, unyielding approach. The detective may have said something like, "We all make mistakes, Joe. We know you're a good person deep down, but right now, the most important thing is to tell the truth. You can make it right." It was at that moment, exhausted and emotionally drained, that Tucker's defenses crumbled. He finally began to speak, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to do it, it just happened. I didn't plan it. I was frustrated, I just lost it." These words were the beginning of his confession. As the detectives continued to listen quietly, they offered no interruptions, giving Tucker the space to fully process his emotions. He began to speak more clearly, recounting the events of that night in fragmented sentences. "I didn't know what came over me. I was angry. I went to her house. I was just so angry, and she didn't even know who I was. I just wanted to talk, but it went wrong. She tried to fight me off. I didn't know what I was doing. I hurt her. I didn't mean to." He admitted to breaking into the house and to attacking Jana, but he never fully explained why he targeted her. His explanation was muddled, filled with guilt, but lacking coherent reasoning. "I didn't know why I did it," he muttered. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I just snapped." He spoke of his frustration and anger, emotions that had clearly been building up in his life for some time. There was no clear motive, no rationalization. His confession reflected the chaos in his mind, the the feeling of being overwhelmed by emotions that he couldn't control. The detectives, though they were seeking the truth, also recognized the complexity of what Tucker was experiencing. At the end of the confession, Joe Tucker seemed to realize the gravity of what he had done. He looked down, his voice quiet but resigned, as if he were facing the inevitable. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," he repeated, though the words seemed hollow. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I never wanted to." The detectives, now certain of his involvement, began to wrap up the questioning. Tucker's admission was exactly what they needed to close the case. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Jana Reynolds, as well as the sexual assault that had occurred during the attack. For the Reynolds family, Joe Tucker's confession brought an unsettling sense of closure. They had waited for years for this moment, and finally, they knew who had taken their beloved daughter's life. But despite the confession, there was no real sense of satisfaction. The tragedy of losing Jana so violently couldn't be erased by the mere admission of guilt. Joe Tucker's confession did not provide a clear reason for his actions. His motives remained murky, clouded by his own emotions and frustrations. For the investigators and the community, it was a sobering reminder of the unpredictable nature of violence and the ways in which people can snap under pressure. Though his confession marked the end of the investigation, it left a deep scar in the fabric of Mount Vernon, a town forever changed by the loss of one of its own.
The investigation into Jason Reuter's death quickly turned cold after the initial flurry of activity in 2005. Despite the best efforts of the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office, the case seemed to stall at every turn. The mystery surrounding Jason's murder left his family in a constant state of uncertainty. But their resolve to uncover the truth never wavered. Below is a breakdown of key events over the years as the case, initially forgotten by many, gradually came back into focus. On August 6, 2005, Jason Reuter's life was tragically taken from him. His body was discovered in his Salt Lake City area home, with clear signs of multiple stab wounds. The lack of forced entry, coupled with the cryptic argument overheard by a neighbor, left investigators with very few leads. Jason Mitchell Reuter was far more than a name in a cold case file. He was a devoted father of two, celebrated for his creative spirit and a razor-sharp, often horribly funny sense of humor. His talent for doodling, whether on old newspapers or the walls of the garage, never failed to spark laughter, especially from his sisters, Nikki Price and Stephanie Pershon. Despite finding a bloodied knife with Jason's DNA at the scene, authorities couldn't identify a suspect. The DNA found at the scene, which included both Jason's and an unidentified individual's, was entered into CODIS, Combined DNA Index System. But it yielded no matches. Jason's family and friends were devastated. His loved ones even bought space on billboards along the highway, pleading for tips. A $5,000 reward was offered by the Unified Police Department. But the case, despite these efforts, grew cold. For months, the investigation seemed to be on track but quickly faded as new leads failed to emerge. For several years, the case seemed to fall into the abyss of unsolved crimes. Investigators re-examined the evidence from time to time, but as the years passed, leads continued to evaporate. There was no sign of a motive, and although police received occasional tips, they went nowhere. For Jason's family, these were years of frustration and heartache. They remained in constant contact with the authorities, holding on to the hope that one day, someone would provide them with the closure they so desperately needed. By 2011, it was evident that Jason's case had gone cold. However, the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office had not forgotten about him. New investigators were assigned to the case, and cold case protocols began to kick in. Yet, with the passage of time, the lack of new evidence or reliable leads stymied their progress. The case was essentially at a standstill. It wasn't until 2014 that the Sheriff's Office began to review its entire cold case strategy. The hope was that newer investigative techniques, such as DNA testing, might help uncover fresh clues. However, this period of renewed interest did not yield immediate results. Jason's family, still steadfast in their search for justice, leaned on each other during these years of waiting, refusing to let the case fade into oblivion. Jason's sisters continued their efforts, remaining in regular contact with law enforcement. "I know this could have stalled, but they would not stop until it was done," said Nikki Price. Their persistence mattered. In 2015, after nearly a decade of no progress, The case was handed over to the Salt Lake County Cold Case Unit. The detectives who inherited the case were driven by the hope that the latest forensic technologies could uncover crucial information. Jason's family, who had been vocal in their calls for justice, saw the transfer of the case to the Cold Case Unit as a sign of renewed commitment. However, even with the fresh perspective and resources of the Cold Case Unit, investigators found themselves back at square one. The lack of new evidence made it difficult to move forward, and the case continued to hang in limbo. For Jason's family, it was a period of both hope and despair, as they began to wonder if their beloved relative's murder would ever be solved. Over the years, the Reuter family kept fighting for answers, despite the case remaining inactive. They continued to advocate for their loved one, attending public meetings and trying to engage local media to keep their father's memory alive. The family's outreach efforts were tireless, hoping that a new approach or development would finally unearth the truth. Despite little public progress behind the scenes, law enforcement continued to re-examine every aspect of the case. Detectives sought out new ways of utilizing forensic tools, even revisiting DNA samples collected in the early stages of the investigation. However, advancements in technology still weren't enough to bring them closer to a suspect. Jason's family often revisited their personal memories of the man they loved, holding on to the belief that one day, someone would come forward with the truth. By 2020, investigators had begun to explore the application of advanced DNA technology, such as familial DNA searches. New forensic techniques, including genetic genealogy, allowed law enforcement to identify potential familial links to suspects through databases. Although still in its infancy, this technology represented a game changer for cold cases. It provided a glimmer of hope for cases like Jason's, where traditional investigative methods had failed. However, despite the promise of new technology, Jason's case did not see a breakthrough this year. The hope that these new methods would provide a viable lead continued to push the investigation forward, but the Reuter family still struggled with their grief. They continued to hold their vigil for justice, never allowing the case to slip from public awareness. In late 2021, the Utah law enforcement community launched the innovative Cold Case Playing Cards initiative. The cards, which featured victims' faces and case details, were distributed in jails and prisons across the state, with the goal of generating new leads, or encouraging individuals with information to come forward. Jason's case was one of many included in the program. For his family, this was a new source of hope, even if it didn't immediately yield any new tips. In 2022, in a creative and desperate attempt to bring attention to Utah's cold cases, the Unified Police Department launched a campaign using a deck of playing cards. Each card featured a photo and details of a missing person or homicide victim. Jason Reuter's case was among them. The deck was distributed in jails and prisons, the idea being that inmates might recognize a name or a face and come forward with information. The initiative wasn't guaranteed to work, but for Jason's sisters, it was another chance. "It might shake up some dirt," said Stephanie Pershin, "and that's exactly what we need." Despite the passage of years, the Playing Cards campaign represented a turning point. It kept Jason's case in the public eye and renewed interest in solving the crime. For the Reuter family, it symbolized their continued fight for justice and their refusal to let Jason be forgotten. It wasn't until 2024 that a breakthrough in the case finally arrived. The Utah Bureau of Forensic Services flagged DNA from a separate case, linked to Mark Nelson Munoz, who had been arrested in another state. Munoz's DNA matched the evidence found at Jason Reuter's crime scene. This match led detectives back to Munoz, who had evaded justice for nearly 2 decades. The DNA breakthrough proved that advancements in forensic science, especially DNA matching, could breathe new life into cold cases. It allowed investigators to close in on a suspect after years of frustration. However, even with the discovery of Munoz's identity, the task of locating him proved to be difficult. He was known to be unhoused and had a transient lifestyle, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track him down. On January 23, 2025, after years of pursuit, Mark Nelson Munoz was apprehended in connection with the 2005 murder of Jason Reuter. His arrest marked a long-awaited and emotional moment for Jason's family. After nearly 2 decades of uncertainty and pain, they finally saw a glimmer of hope that justice was within reach. Munoz was charged with first-degree felony murder, though details surrounding his motive remain unclear. The Reuter family felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Jason's son, Andrew, who was only a child when his father was killed, expressed that it felt as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I just feel so much better," he said, reflecting on the years of anger and grief that had consumed him. His aunts echoed that sentiment. Stephanie Pershin said, "I just want to say how much of a relief this is. It has been a long 20 years. Detective Ben Pendern, who worked the cold case, and Salt Lake County Sheriff Rosie Rivera both addressed the public. Rivera stated, "This arrest is a testament to the dedication and commitment of our detectives, who never gave up on finding justice for Jason Reuter." District Attorney Sim Gill emphasized that the legal process was only beginning, but expressed hope that the charges would help the family begin to heal. As of 2025, the investigation into Jason's murder remains active. Detectives continue to seek any further evidence that may shed light on the motive behind the killing. While Mark Munoz has been arrested, he has not been cooperative with authorities, making it difficult for investigators to understand the reasons behind Jason's death. The case, which had remained dormant for nearly 20 years, is once again a focal point of law enforcement's attention. While justice may have taken decades to arrive, the Reuter family has expressed deep gratitude that their beloved Jason's case has finally seen progress. "It has been a long 20 years, said Jason's sister, Stephanie, reflecting on the emotional toll the case has taken on their family. Though the family's grief is far from over, the arrest of Mark Munoz brings them one step closer to understanding why Jason's life was taken so senselessly.